Ôi phố Soviet như ôi nhà cái liệt Cambodia na Cambodia ơi na nè ban nhàជួយកម្ពុជាដោយកំពុំឈុកហើយរត់
When I was a young king in Cambodia, that was in the years 40s, there were already predictions saying that black people coming from the forest went into our towns, and Cambodia would have to face misery. So the citizens in towns had to disappear, and there would be famine, hunger, and there would be streets without people, houses without people. The predictions were made by monks, Buddhist monks, celebrated astrologers. We could not explain the phenomenon black people. In fact, the Khmer Rouge, they had black pajamas, and they forced in April 1975 all the citizens to go to the countryside, and they killed so many people. I did not see any killing, but I saw the misery of my people. There was no freedom, and there was forced labor, etc. So, even personally, I believe in such predictions. It is astrology.
Before the chaos and doom foretold by that prophecy, Prince Norodom Sihanouk had dominated power as the last god king of Cambodia. Like all the kings before him, he personified Cambodia. His political moves, his personal strengths and failings were bound to shape the country's fortunes. So when he was overthrown by a coup d'etat in 1970, Cambodia was set on its path of destruction. The country was ravaged by war and carnage before Cambodia's communists, the Khmer Rouge, came to power. When they launched a revolution to destroy the old society, they were seen as the black people. The prophecy had been fulfilled. And whether trapped by fate or his own political folly, Prince Sihanouk, the living symbol of monarchy, had joined with the revolutionaries before their rise to power and embraced their infamous leader, Pol Pot.
Pol Pot is mad, you know, like Hitler. Like Hitler, Pol Pot does not believe in God, but he thinks that heaven, destiny wants him to guide Cambodia in the way he thinks it is the best for Cambodia, that is to say, the worst.
The people are in high spirits for their beloved party secretary, Comrade Pol Pot, and other leading comrades of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Cambodia and of the government have come to attend this meeting. Comrade Pol Pot delivered a speech amidst warm applause. He extended warmest greetings and congratulations to the people and the Revolutionary Army on the various fronts.
Sometimes people can appear as very gentle, very innocent, and Pol Pot is very charming, very innocent. His face, his behavior even is very polite, but he's very, very cruel.
Under the wise and correct leadership of the revolutionary organization, Cambodia is one great work site, a land in construction.
For 3.5 years, the forced labour and endless purges were hidden from the outside world. Above all, the Khmer Rouge were obsessed to seal off their revolution from any control by their neighbour, Communist Vietnam. They would fight the Vietnamese rather than serve under Hanoi's control. With the communist world divided, Pol Pot was backed by China, while Vietnam was aligned to the Soviet bloc.
Pol Pot chose the Chinese camp against the Vietnamese and against what my Chinese friends call Soviet hegemonism. So the approach of Pol Pot was to make provocation against the Vietnamese. So the result was that we had a war with Vietnam, and that was catastrophic for us.
When the Vietnamese invaded to seize control of the country, the end of Pol Pot's rule did not bring an end to the suffering in Cambodia.
And now, after the invasion of my country by the Vietnamese, our people becomes slaves of Moscow and of Hanoi. Now we have to face Vietnamese imperialism and colonialism, so I have to fight. How can you persuade the Vietnamese and the Soviet to let us be independent again? I have no prejudice. I love too much my country to be the man of factions, but I want to be the man of national unity, national reconciliation.
For generations, Cambodia was a backward. Despite the conflicts all round, this was not a land that was ripe for revolution. Down through the centuries, the Khmer people, Cambodians, had never had a problem of overpopulation or a shortage of land for growing rice. Peasant farmers were poor, but nearly all worked in family groups on land of their own. The idea of communes or collective farms was hardly attractive. On the surface, life was absurdly innocent.
When we started as a nation more than 1,000 years ago, we had what Western scholars used to call God kings, because the kings then were gods. They represented everything, including the gods. So everything was centered on the king. And I think that it is one of the reasons why we were so strong, because the people united all around the king. You know, even the intellectuals, they were very obedient to the king. So the king could then lead the people on the way towards more and more strength, and we became an empire. We got from India a heavy and beneficial influence. For instance, Angkor Wat, the most famous temple in Cambodia, was inspired by the Indian culture and the architecture and the prayers of the priests and so on. The religions, Brahmanism, Buddhism, were all from India. It is very fascinating because there was a Hindu Khmer marriage without any military means, conquest and so on. Even our monarchy was half Indian and half Khmer.
Fortune and patronage radiated from the king down through his courts to peasants in the countryside. Cambodia's strength as an empire was based on rice. The great god kings had power to mobilize labor. Complex irrigation works were built. Up to 3 crops of rice a year were harvested. It was the divine role of kings to fertilize the fields, harmonize the seasons. But it also followed that times of drought, political upheaval or defeats in battle were signs that a king's divine energy had drained away. Then loyalties broke down. Even at the height of its glory, Cambodia's fortunes oscillated according to the personal charisma of each of the Angkor kings. By the 15th century, the empire had collapsed. The royal courts and rituals survived, but the potency of the god kings had clearly faded. A more personal form of Buddhist faith took root in Cambodia.
Before we were Brahmanist, Buddhist, but not Hinayana. Hinayana Buddhism preaches, you know, tolerance, non-violence, and the renunciation to strength, to force. So we became weak.
In popular songs and drama, the villains who threatened Cambodia were always its neighbours, the Thais or the Vietnamese. The art of survival was to play off one against the other. This play tells the story of one Cambodian king who married a Vietnamese princess. It was a marriage of convenience to seal an alliance with the Vietnamese. But according to the play, the king was outwitted by his Vietnamese wife. She insisted on taking Cambodian land to form what is now the south of Vietnam. Cambodia's kings were no longer warriors. They learned to live by compromise and appeasement. It would be the Vietnamese who posed the ultimate threat to Cambodia. Originally from China, the Vietnamese had pushed southwards, but their expansion to the west was checked by mountain ranges. So this natural barrier came to separate the two different cultures of Indochina. The Vietnamese were populous, imbued with Chinese realism. By contrast, the Thais, the Lao and Cambodians clung to their Indian beliefs and culture. They were less worldly and worked their land at a gentler pace. As Vietnamese numbers increased, they needed more land. Cambodians feared their ambitions.
You know, there was and there is still racial antagonism between the Vietnamese and the Cambodians. The main reason why we cannot understand each other or like each other is simply of a military nature. The Vietnamese, they are very expansionist, militarist. They are conquerors, conquérants in French. So we, the Cambodian, we are pacifist. We like peace. So when we see people so bellicose, warmongers, really we feel very uncomfortable vis-à-vis such a people.
Ironically, it was the arrival of the French that saved Cambodia from disappearing altogether. Cambodia's king actually welcomed the French when they colonized Indochina in the 1860s. He submitted to France. The kingdom became a protectorate. But that was a lesser evil than losing Cambodia completely to the Vietnamese. For their part, it suited the French to preserve Cambodia's royal courts. They'd keep Indochina divided and use figurehead kings to endorse their rule. The last thing the French wanted was to stir up political change.
The French used to be called the colonialists, but like the Hindus, they did not try to force us to be French. They came and they were helping us in the process of safeguarding Khmer civilization, Khmer culture. And so very freely we chose also to be French educated, to speak French alongside the Khmers and so on.
As a young prince, Sihanouk was one of the privileged few to see any benefits at all from colonial rule. In 1941, at the age of 18, Sihanouk was chosen by the French to be king. In favouring Sihanouk, they'd passed over a rival branch of the royal family because they imagined the prince would be easily controlled. He was more concerned with affairs of the heart than matters of state.
Since I was the only child, my parents, they wanted me to be happy. And after that, there are Westerners who like to say that I was a playboy and so on, because I used to have a good life, so I am accustomed to good cuisine and sports cars and so on. But
the French were pleased to indulge his whims. Although Sihanouk held no power, nonetheless he was revered as a god-king. His role was to serve as patron and perform the ancient rituals. For most Cambodians, even figurehead kings were the source of all fertility. Just to touch his robes or the dust at his feet was a blessing with royal potency. For peasants in the countryside, life would barely change at all during 90 years of colonial rule. The French were not concerned with village life. They built roads and plantations, and apart from that, they simply collected taxes. The rest was ignored. Even schooling and health at the village level were of little concern to France. For their part, Cambodia's peasants were typically docile. They were loath to pass up their age-old beliefs or methods of farming. There was little incentive on either side to disturb the status quo. Here, the state of the art was timeless. In these villages, there was no revolution to even a simple pottery wheel. Instead, village women still turned themselves about the clay. And they had no need for kilns. The pots were cured on an open fire. Plantations of coffee, rubber and other crops were a source of export earnings that repaid France. But the local benefits were few. By preference, the French imported Vietnamese workers rather than hiring native Khmers. It was much the same in the towns. Middle-class Khmers were shunted aside. Slowly but surely, Chinese merchants were allowed to dominate commerce. And the French relied on Vietnamese clerks and petty officials to staff their colonial service. Cambodians lagged behind, and for nearly half the 20th century, there was no political ferment to bother the French. By contrast, the Vietnamese next door were far from dormant. Their poverty and hardships encouraged opposition against the French. The Vietnamese also had a long tradition of scholars, writers and political activists. Cambodia had none. Not one Cambodian book was written, and there was no Cambodian newspaper before the 1930s. The time would come when Cambodia paid a price for its lack of worldly experience and its lack of depth in leaders. The rise of Japan during World War II finally broke the spell of white colonial power. Although the Japanese occupation of Indochina was short-lived, it did show that Europeans were not invincible. After the war, when France returned to reclaim her colonies, she was faced with serious trouble. Vietnamese nationalists, known as the Viet Minh, had taken up arms to oust the French from all of Indochina. The struggle for independence was inspired by Ho Chi Minh. As Uncle Ho, he became a legendary hero to the Vietnamese people. At that time, the Viet Minh were simply seen as freedom fighters. They had broad support from all Vietnamese, regardless of class or political leanings. But the ultimate goal for Ho Chi Minh was more than national independence. His life was dedicated to a communist revolution. The worst of the war was fought in Vietnam. But in Laos and Cambodia as well, the Viet Minh combined with local resistance to harass the French. Leading a revolution was out of the question for Sihanouk. He was in no position to oppose the French by force of arms. However, as the war dragged on, he began his own manoeuvres to win Cambodia's independence.
When the French made me king, I remained grateful to the French, but I had to try to force the French to give back independence to the land of Angkor. We used to be a great nation, and France could be our good friend, but should not make us a colony.
Sihanouk was determined not to rely on a Viet Minh victory to end French rule. That might end the monarchy as well. Instead, he launched on a crusade overseas to win press support and embarrass the French with their allies in Europe and America. He proved to be a master of publicity and diplomatic flair. In fact, Cambodia's independence was granted in 1953. This was several months before the French were finally defeated in their war against the Viet Minh. Sihanouk then had won all the kudos for Cambodia's independence. He had stolen a march on the revolutionaries. The king had discovered a taste for politics, but he knew his palace would not be the seat of power. Cambodia now had a parliament, and new elections were due to follow soon after independence. Despite Sihanouk's personal standing, the strongest political party was clearly opposed to the old ruling class, and even the monarchy itself. It drew support from teachers, students, government workers, and those who'd fought the French.
One part of the Cambodian nation, they want Cambodia to be a republic, to be like a France. And since then we had many political parties, and the intellectuals in Cambodia, you know, as a French educated people, they studied mainly the history of French revolution, the cutting off of the head of kings, and so on. So the leader in Cambodia cannot be a king. He must be the president of his country, powerful enough to lead the country, but with an opposition, with a parliament.
Sihanouk's answer was to abdicate and to leave the throne to his father. No longer king, he was free to stand for election. The opposition was caught off balance by Sihanouk's move. The popular vote was never in doubt, and he was elected head of state by a large majority. Sihanouk was convinced that the unity of his people rested on his shoulders and his alone. Only he could serve as a bridge to bring Cambodia into the 20th century. The prince was driven by a passion to be all things to all his people. As he bounced through the countryside, he was still hailed as the Father King, despite his abdication. Whatever city people thought, the mystique of godly energy would never fade for villagers. He was a poet, musician, songwriter, and even the lyrics were by Norodom Sihanouk. Cambodia's press was dominated by the words and deeds of Norodom Sihanouk. And radio talks for hours on end carried the voice of Norodom Sihanouk. The views on every issue, from international politics to the latest village gossip, were those of Norodom Sihanouk. And to top it all, he turned his hand to filmmaking, the writer, director and star being Norodom Sihanouk. Sihanouk played many roles, but he was never seen as a military dictator. Indeed, the army was kept very small and the leaders divided, so they wouldn't pose a threat to Sihanouk's rule. There was little chance for either left or right-wing opponents to steal the limelight from Sihanouk. He insisted that all rival parties and factions merge with his own political movement, called the Sangkum. Every 6 months, a national congress was staged where Cambodians from all walks of life could air their complaints to the prince in person. In practice, any critics or wayward members of government were exposed to public ridicule. Sihanouk claimed all credits, but he stood aloof from his government's failings. When right-wing ministers proved to be unpopular, he preempted opposition by calling on the left to form a cabinet of their own. One idealist who dared to speak out against corruption was a popular intellectual named Khieu Samphan. For his temerity, he was attacked in a public street after the Congress, stripped naked and humiliated by security police. In a later crackdown on leftists, Khieu Samphan was forced to flee to the jungle. There he joined up with a tiny cell of communist outcasts. His comrades included Pol Pot and other radicals who'd studied in France. Khieu Samphan would re-emerge in the 1970s as a leader of the Khmer Rouge. The thesis he'd written in Paris would serve as a blueprint for Pol Pot's revolution.
I know very well the family of Pol Pot. Khieu Samphan also. They are normal Cambodians, those intellectuals. I gave scholarship to Pol Pot, to Salot Saw, to Ieng Sari. They were nationalists. And when they went to France, and after studying in France, to become a teacher, professor in our colleges, so they returned to Cambodia as communists. I used to say that if I want my students not to get raped, to become communists, I have to send them to communist countries. So they see that the life there is very hard, but communism in France, you know, that was a good thing. And after being French-style communist, they chose to be Chinese-style, and they were very impressed by the so-called cultural revolution.
Cambodia's Communist Party itself was small, and even then it was splintered by factions and plotting. They found some recruits amongst hill tribes in the most neglected back blocks of the country, but to other Cambodians, these minority tribes were black, uncivilized people. While Sihanouk ruled, there was little support for communist ideas in the rest of the countryside. He pushed for reforms to deny any chance to the radicals. Both health and education were top priorities. For the first time, schooling was extended free to all Cambodian children, and that included girls who were never accepted in the old pagoda schools run by monks. Education boomed throughout the 1950s and 60s. Just a decade after the French had gone, there were 4 times as many students. Universities also mushroomed. There was none at all before independence, but now Sihanouk had opened several. As more and more students enrolled, however, the boom was inviting problems. There was a clamour for government jobs and a taste for urban living. The cities and towns were a magnet. Any schooling at all meant rising expectations and a chance to escape from work on the land. Like most developing countries, Cambodia wanted symbols of progress and the trappings of modernisation. To fund the new development, Sihanouk depended on foreign aid from America, France and other Western countries. But as the big powers vied for influence in the Third World, Sihanouk also turned to the communist bloc for economic aid. Sihanouk wanted a greater stake for Cambodians in their own economy. So in the 1960s, he launched a drive to nationalise the import-export trade and other key industries. This was a bid to wrest control from local Chinese merchants who dominated commerce. The results were a minor disaster. State corporations were corrupt and badly managed. They were no match for Chinese business efficiency. But despite the failures of nationalisation, Sihanouk was firmly entrenched. He was not about to be toppled by domestic problems. Cambodia's peace, however, was constantly overshadowed by the conflicts on its borders. When Viet Minh forces overran the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, that was the close of just one chapter in the struggle for Indochina. The French had been humiliated, but the Geneva Agreement to end the war was doomed to fail when America refused to endorse the settlement. The Geneva Agreement declared both Laos and Cambodia neutral, but Vietnam was divided north and south between the pro and anti-communists. The agreement was broken, and fighting flared in the south almost as soon as the French had departed. Nothing, it seemed, could stop the new war from engulfing neutral Cambodia. America now stepped in. It was backing the South Vietnamese under the rule of Ngo Dinh Diem. President Diem was a Roman Catholic and bitterly opposed to the Viet Cong and Communist North Vietnam. On the other side, the Soviet Union and China were backing Ho Chi Minh against the might of America and its anti-communist allies. With the superpowers bent on destruction, how would Cambodia survive as a neutral? Everything hinged on Sihanouk's personal diplomacy. He chose the path of non-alignment, no military pacts or alliances. He depended on America and France to back his neutrality. But like it or not, he would also deal with the communist camp. He went out of his way to garner the friendship of China, the communist Vietnamese, and the Soviet Union as well. Sihanouk was walking a tightrope, but his aim was to play off the big powers against each other and leave Cambodia out of their war. But November 1963 would prove to be a turning point. The Americans backed a coup d'etat against their own ally in South Vietnam. President Ngo Dinh Diem was overthrown and assassinated. Sihanouk was shaken. If that's how America dealt with an ally, what would they do to a neutral? It may be a matter of months or several years, declared Sihanouk, but the United States cannot win a military victory in Vietnam. Within 2 weeks of Ngo Dinh Diem's fall, Sihanouk ordered the Americans out of Cambodia. And regardless of cost to his tiny economy, he refused to accept any further American aid. He was adamant that any reliance on the United States was now a peril. To Sihanouk, there was only one power with a genuine interest in keeping Cambodia neutral. He turned to China. There was no question of military links. Sihanouk's gamble was based on the strength of his personal friendship with China's premier, Zhou Enlai.
I had much admiration for Zhou Enlai. He was a great statesman, a man with a good heart, and he was very, very popular in China. We met, Zhou Enlai and myself. That was in April 1955 in Bandung. So we became friends since then. He used to tell me that I was the symbol of an independent, neutral and peaceful Cambodia.
In the eyes of Uncle Sam, Sihanouk was courting the devil. But despite America's phobia, it was not a threat from China or even communism that Sihanouk had to fear. The paramount threat to Cambodia would always be the Vietnamese, whatever political mask they wore. He needed to come to terms with the communist side before their victory and to use the clout of China to restrain the Vietnamese. Although China was backing Ho Chi Minh with massive aid and war materials, like Sihanouk, the Chinese leaders were wary of Hanoi's ambitions. The Vietnamese would be a thorn in China's flank if they were allowed to dominate all of Indochina after the war was won. As the war in Vietnam grew, the United States became more and more frustrated. And one of its greatest frustrations was the Viet Cong's use of sanctuaries behind the Cambodian border. In addition, men and supplies from North Vietnam were crossing Cambodian soil as a lifeline to the communist forces. These were the famous Ho Chi Minh trails. Neutral Cambodia was no longer virgin. Sihanouk denied the violations at first, but in fact he had struck a deal with the communist Vietnamese. In return for their use of Cambodia, they agreed to respect her existing borders after the war was over. Sihanouk explained his position 20 years later.
I could see clearly that the Americans one day would like to quit, to live into China, and North Vietnam would be the winner. So I made my best. I made all efforts to get the gratitude of the Vietnamese for my Cambodia. Reason why I helped them. I did not want to do harm to the United States. I like Western culture. I do not speak Vietnamese. My wife is half French, half Cambodian, no Vietnamese blood. I did not conquer any Vietnamese girl when I was a playboy. So I have no connection with Vietnam. I do not hate the United States, but by opportunism, by patriotism, I had to help the North Vietnamese, and I got their permission to respect always Cambodia as an independent state, a neutral state, non-aligned state, without any interference in our internal affairs from Vietnam.
More and more Cambodians, however, were disenchanted by Sihanouk's breach with America. The loss of greenback dollars was taking its toll. Students were grumbling, the army was bitter, and Sihanouk's stifling control rankled the urban classes. To appease the army and his right-wing critics, Sihanouk appointed General Lon Nol to head a new, more conservative government. Lon Nol's partner was a prince named Siri Matak, who came from a branch of the royal family which the French had snubbed when Sihanouk was given the throne. While Sihanouk knew he could bluff Lon Nol, he was not so sure of Siri Matak. Lon Nol himself and others high up were lining their pockets by trucking supplies for the Viet Cong. But despite the corruption, they despised the Viet Cong presence. They yearned for the halcyon days of American spirit before Sihanouk had cut off relations. By the late 1960s, Sihanouk had second thoughts. Alarmed by the discontent, he put out feelers to restore relations with Washington. President Nixon, however, had schemes of his own. In March 1969, Operation Breakfast began. The Americans launched a secret campaign of bombing to strike at the communist sanctuaries in Cambodia. Sihanouk would never admit that he actually approved of America's bombing, but instead of protesting, Sihanouk was uncharacteristically silent. In January 1970, the prince took leave from his mounting problems at home. He left Phnom Penh to fly to France. There he wanted rest and medical attention before going on to Moscow and Peking to make urgent appeals for economic aid. He would also issue a warning to the communist leaders.
I plan to talk to Moscow and Peking and to say to them that they should advise their allies, the Viet Cong, the Viet Minh, to avoid, to prevent themselves from interfering in the affairs of the Cambodian, because Cambodia will not be willing to be communized, and they will meet with strong resistance of the Cambodian people if they want to commonize us.
Protest marches were staged in Phnom Penh during Sihanouk's absence. Although Cambodia's troubles were economic, Lon Nol and Sirimat Pao were turning the frustrations into popular anger against the communist Vietnamese. By attacking the Viet Cong presence, they were attacking Sihanouk's policies, and that was only a step from attacking the master himself.
The Cambodian people reacted by demanding that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese authorities remove their bases from Cambodia. Popular anger grew. There were large demonstrations outside the National Assembly demanding the removal of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese bases. Norodom Sihanouk, faithful to his pro-communist political beliefs, condemned the demonstrators and defended the cause of the communists. In this, he was betraying his country and the Cambodian people.
Do you feel that Americans, say the CIA, has helped to stir up this trouble in Cambodia, or are your people genuinely against the Viet Cong interference there?
Everything is possible, but I do not want to accuse the United States. I have not any proof about it, but I can say that some officers in our army and many deputies and many members of the government in Phnom Penh, they want to be your allies in order to have dollars, your dollars. They don't think about the destiny and the fate of our homeland. They don't mind about it. They are more patriots for dollars than for Cambodia.
Instead of returning to Cambodia, Sihanouk flew on to Moscow and Peking. Perhaps he was confident of returning later with promises of new economic aid, but within a week, the revolt had gone too far, and Sihanouk had lost any chance to regain control.
On March 18, 1970, the National Assembly and the Council of the Kingdom met and voted unanimously to withdraw their confidence in Prince Norodom Sihanouk. Thus, on March 18, 1970, Prince Norodom Sihanouk was no longer the chief of state of Cambodia.
Mais nous n'avons pas une chose. On a fait la première chose à nous faisons.
Ambition. Mr. Lon Nol, my cousin Serimata, they were guided by their personal ambitions. They had to betray Sihanouk in order to be at the top of Cambodia. You know, Lon Nol, it was a mystical. We spoke about the predictions, and according to the most famous astrologers in Cambodia in the years 60s, so Lon Nol had to become one head of state and two, the savior of Buddhism against the threat of communism. And so the interpretation by my the one I trust so much, Lon Nol, and my cousin Serimata, was this. So Lon Nol must be head of state, not Sihanouk. Sihanouk has to disappear. And two, Sihanouk is an accomplice of the communists.
But was that true? Did you ever feel you were an accomplice?
Accomplice.
Or used by the communists?
No. You know, I was conscious that communism was not good. But, you know, I had to be realistic.
When Sihanouk arrived in Peking, he learned the news of his overthrow from his friends, the Chinese leaders. They urged the prince to stay in exile in China and to form a coalition with the communists against Lon Nol and his American backers.
I think Sihanouk's biggest mistake was in simply leaving the country. As long as he was there, he was in pretty good control of things.
The speaker is Alan Dawson, an author and journalist who writes on Indochina.
I think the people who ousted him simply made a miscalculation. I think they wanted to teach him a lesson. But I don't think even the rightest of the right-wing people who were involved in that ever conceived of a day in Cambodia without Sihanouk in power. And a little later, they had a trial that convicted him of high treason in his absence and sentenced him to death in absentia. And at that point, the miscalculation became a severe miscalculation, and Sihanouk could no longer return to the country in any kind of safety. But I think up to that point, he probably could have.
In the drama of March 1970, students, soldiers and agitators stirred up a frenzy of racial hatred against the Vietnamese. The victims were not Viet Cong. They were terrified civilians from Vietnamese families settled in Cambodia for several generations. Far from stopping the bloodletting, General Lon Nol turned a blind eye. Lon Nol was determined to take up the cudgels and to rid Cambodia of the Vietnamese menace. The juggle for peace was over, but there was no conception of what lay ahead. Cambodia's army was absurdly small. Its battle experience was nil. But in a reckless move, the Lon Nol regime issued an ultimatum to the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. All communist forces were ordered to leave Cambodian soil within 72 hours. An impossible demand. And clearly, the communist Vietnamese would never comply under threat. Ready or not, the time of war had come for Cambodia. The call to arms was run like a cloud. Volunteers were eager to join up for a chance to drive out the Vietnamese. This was a war to settle the score of centuries. Cambodians spared nothing in venting their rage. There was no Pol Pot, no Khmer Rouge at this time. This was the work of Lon Nol soldiers, and their victims, they said, were Viet Cong. All of these bodies were cut open and the livers eaten. By this ritual, Cambodians believed they would gain the strength of their enemy.
The Cambodians, they have two faces, two aspects. We can smile and we can also kill. Lon Nol first in the years 70s, and also Pol Pot after that. They made a pogrom of their Jews. That is to say, the Vietnamese. I think that it is not the best way to deal with the Vietnamese. We have to try to be in friendly terms relations with them, not to provoke them, not to make pogrom and so on, because the Vietnamese, they are willing to take revenge against the the Cambodians.
It was not so much revenge as a cold tactical necessity. The Vietnamese Communist forces simply swept aside the best of Lon Nol's troops within days of the outbreak of war. They took control of all the provinces they needed to ensure their vital supply lines to South Vietnam would not be jeopardized. Cambodians seemed to relish the grand heroics of battle. But courage alone was not enough against the experience of Ho Chi Minh's guerrillas, who'd been at war for over 30 years. To Lon Nol, the war was a religious crusade which he insisted on directing in person. Advice and logic meant nothing. He preferred to consult with fortune-tellers before planning his battles.
If Lon Nol did not make the coup, I was sure to save Cambodia because, you know, by dealing with Hanoi and with speaking, and I was a good friend of Moscow also, I could save Cambodia. One day I saw that one day there would be peace between the West and the communist power, and since, you know, I gave some facilities to the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong, so I could have them as friends and grateful to me and through me to Cambodia. They promised very firmly not to attack us. But since Mr. Lon Nol chose to be with the Americans and against the Viet Cong, so it happened that the contre-coup, the boomerang effect was that Cambodia lost everything.
Just as Lon Nol had dreamed, the Americans were generous with aid. Arms and dollars flowed in to prop up the new regime. For President Nixon, this was an opportunity to openly strike at the communist sanctuaries in Cambodia. At worst, he could window dress Vietnam by spreading the war next door.
Tonight, American and South Vietnamese units will attack the headquarters for the entire communist military operation in South Vietnam. This key control center has been occupied by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong for 5 years in blatant violation of Cambodia's neutrality. This is not an invasion of Cambodia. Our purpose is not to occupy the areas. Once enemy forces are driven out of these sanctuaries, and once their military supplies are destroyed, we will withdraw.
The fabled communist headquarters were never found. The result of the invasion was simply to drive the Vietnamese communists deeper into Cambodia to avoid the Americans. So the heaviest casualties were not Viet Cong, but Cambodian. President Nixon had not even told Lon Nol, let alone asked his approval, before the invasion. The American troops did withdraw as promised. But for the next 3 years, American airstrikes continued to pound Cambodia in a bid to hold back the communists from overrunning the Lon Nol side.